Hoyoverse has got to be one of the funniest video game companies ever with these Hall of Fame banners. Shenhe was a character that didn't really age the best, as Hoyoverse just refused to make more good cryo DPS that synergized with her, and her best teammate Ayaka was out of the meta for so long, to the point they just didn't want to rerun her, as she would get no sales. So they decided to break their own rules to place her on the Leeway Chronicled Wish. But now, suddenly, now that Escoffier and Skirk are coming out, she's too good for the Chronicled Wish banner. So they're now going to be cycling her back into a rerun, now that she actually has value again with these characters. Touche, Hoyoverse. Hello there, Flip here, and today we're going to be going over the 5.7 banners coming soon, in which the characters are going to be Skirk and Shenhe in the first half, with Emilie and Mavuika in the second half, most likely. I'll just be talking about how valuable all these characters are, and then close out the video by discussing the weapon banner and if their constellations or weapons are a better investment to get for the characters. But before we do that, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk about various topics regarding Genshin's meta and I'll try to keep you updated. Shout out to all my lovely channel members, hugs and kisses to you all. And with that out of the way, let's begin, starting with Skirk. Alright, I know the Skirk memes are hilarious, some of the funniest I've seen in this community. Though putting that aside, Skirk is still a really good character, albeit a bit expensive. As we know, she's a cryo DPS designed around freeze teams in mind, in which if you're capable of building her strongest team core, which is just utilizing Farina and Escoffier, even if you're playing characters like Layla, Dahlia who'll be on her banner, or better yet Rosaria, you get one of the strongest damage dealers in the game with the very brain-dead playstyle. And Skirk's also going to have synergy in the new endgame mode that's about to come out, so there's another reason you may want to pick her up too. She has close to 100% interruption resistance, and with having the second/third best numbers in the game, she's not going to fall off anytime soon. So if you have an Escoffier and or Farina to a lesser extent, there's no real reason for you not to get Skirk, unless you already have other top tier DPS units, or your Escoffier is currently taken elsewhere. However, if you don't have the Cryo Chef or don't plan on getting her, Skirk becomes less of a high priority pull as it stands currently, just because the Hydra and Cryo roster isn't really that developed enough to utilize her well. The best you can do without Escoffier is using a team like Yulon, Sitlali, Shenhe, which still does reach quite high numbers but is worse than what other DPS units can build. So if your account is relatively new and you can't free up any current premium Hydra or Cryo units, then like with other DPS, you won't really be heavily affected by not having her. As I always say, the pull value of a DPS just depends on your current roster. If you have the characters the DPS needs and think the ones you have right now are falling off, then go for the strongest DPS that can be played in your current roster. Anyone who has been pulling a lot in Natlin won't really need Skirk, as every Natlin DPS over the patch has aged amazingly with buffs. So Skirk would be for accounts that maybe haven't picked up a DPS in a while, which with all your saved pulls you can try aim for an Escoffier and Skirk to have one of the strongest duos going into Nodcry, and we'll see how that ages into the next few years. The only real flaws present in Skirk's kits currently is the fact that her AoE really isn't the best, but abysses have been mostly single target oriented anyway, so maybe not a massive issue for her for now. You don't get to see her really amazing burst animation that much, unfortunately. Skirk also doesn't really have a way of front-loading damage besides her default burst, but this means that you no longer get to normal attack for the rest of your rotation, as it won't be cryo infused, which is kind of cringe. And as we know, she's quite expensive, which a lot of people have problems with. TLDR, Skirk is a top 5, maybe even top 3 DPS with Escoffier. If that interests you, then go ahead and get her. I doubt you'll be disappointed. With that fake quantum character aside, let's talk about the real cryo queen, Shenhe. In the span of 2 patches, this character has had one of the most insane glow-ups I've seen in a while, going from a character that no one should have really considered pulling, to now being a part of some very strong teams. Everyone say thank you, Escoffier. Shenhe has a cryo buffer that gives her physical and cryo rest shard with her burst, as well as a damage bonus, while also giving a really strong teammate flat damage increase. Currently, alongside Escoffier, she's the best teammate for arguably all the cryo main DPS currently, in Ayaka, Skirk, Ganyu, and Wriothesley, but I do want to put a semi-asterisk on that. The thing with Shenhe and her quills is that one cast of her skill honestly doesn't increase damage by that much. This is the reason why even though Wriothesley is a cryo DPS, before Escoffier, Shenhe wasn't used in his best teams, and was quite replaceable. You much rather would have run double Hydra or melt-ups with him. But in a case like Ayaka, the reason why Shenhe is so good for her is due to the fact that after your first skill cast, when Ayaka uses her burst, you can swap it back into Shenhe and use a second cast of her skill, making your cool count double, which is one of the main things that puts Shenhe ahead of other supports for Ayaka, as her buffing is a lot more impactful in those cases. You can even see how this translates with Ayaka's triple cryo teams having a noticeable gap over her double Hydra teams, whereas with Wriothesley and Skirk, the gap between Yulon and Shenhe isn't that high, if not Yulon can be better. So even though Shenhe is the best cryo support, she isn't necessarily that good for characters other than Ayaka and Ganyu that can be freely swapped out. We just kind of don't have an option right now capable of replacing her entirely, so there's a very high chance that whenever Hoyoverse decides to care about cryo again, they could release a cryo buffer more synergistic with most of the cryo cast than Shenhe. So despite the fact that she is good right now, she's quite replaceable currently for Skirk and Wriothesley with characters like Yelan, and she may be entirely power crept in the future. And just keep in mind, Escoffier is a much more important character to all the cryo DPS than Shenhe currently is, so if you're wondering who to pick up first, Escoffier should always be prioritized. Last, let's move on to the second half with Mavuika and Emilie, starting with the Pyro Archon, who is now back for her second rerun. You know what I mean. She's aged pretty amazingly, and I don't see her dropping off anytime soon. Mavuika has two playstyles in which she's one of the best off-field damage dealers and one of the best on-field DPS, so because it's easier, let's talk about her off-field prospects first. I guess for a starting point, Mavuika's the best in slot choice as a Pyro sub DPS for every single Natlin carry right now, because she's able to dish out a ton of damage while applying Pyro frequently enough to facilitate reactions like burning for Kenichi, being able to allow Mulan to vape everything in her kit. Ichaska doesn't need Pyro application per se, but Mavuika aids in just being able to be an AoE nuke, whilst being an element to give her an extra bullet. And for Veressa Overload team, she's the best pick there as well. In terms of actual supportive capabilities, she does provide minor buffing and can hold the scroll set, though for a majority of the teams you're playing her in, you much rather have Codex on her, and another Natlin support is able to hold the scroll set. I guess for Natlin characters, she also helps trigger more frequent Night Soul bursts. The only thing about Mavuika as an off-field DPS though is that despite the fact that she's the ceiling of these teams and the most convenient, she's also kind of replaceable for a lot of these characters. Mavuika thankfully isn't a Nahida or Farina situation where these characters lose so much by not having her. The Natlin DPS I think is the most dependent on her here is Chaska, just because of how much she tanks in AoE, which Mavuika helps with. But for Veressa, Bennett and Xiangling are honestly fine replacements, and Bennett can even be preferred with a very strong Veressa, as the damage Mavuika adds will matter less. For Kenichi, Mavuika's optimally holding Deepwood or Scroll anyways, so she doesn't do that much damage due to a lack of buffs, which makes Pyro MC also a good alternative, especially if they're able to hold a supportive sword. I guess Muolani does also gain quite a lot from Mavuika, as she actually just feels a lot better than both Xiangling and Pyro MC, as well as adding another vaped or melted nuke from her burst. So Mavuika's good for the entire Natlin roster. Unless you're playing Chaska and Muolani, I don't think she's going to be doing that much for you. And besides the Natlin roster, there's Wriothesley, Chlorinde, and Navia. For Chlorinde, she's actually really good because she also enables Eonton's C6, which Chlorinde will then be able to upkeep Eonton's buff on top of her C6 by herself once Mavuika procs it. And Chlorinde's overload teams with Mavuika are a lot higher in terms of damage than her other teams and archetypes. So if you are using an overload Chlorinde, I can really recommend Mavuika in that case. Funnily enough, I think Mavuika does more for Chlorinde than Veressa teams. For Wriothesley, I've talked about this in my comparison video between the Pyro supports a while back, but I really don't like his Mavuika teams much, unless you're doing something like Burn Melt. And even now, you're currently much better using Escoffier. And then lastly, with Navia, her dual DPS teams with Mavuika are amazing, and probably her strongest team right now. But as I said in my last banner review, unless you're fighting enemies with innate Cryo or Hydro auras, which Mavuika can do a big front-loaded hit on, there isn't that much of a difference between your Farina variants. But if your Farina is occupied, then this will be a decent upgrade over whatever else you could have run. Besides those characters, there isn't anyone else that would really want Mavuika that badly except like Ganyu, though I also think her Escoffier teams are much more comfortable. So yeah, what I do think is a better use of Mavuika is to just play her as a DPS. She's one of the strongest in the game currently with a ton of quality of life. The two best teams you can build for her are either Melt setups or Overload teams. Her Melt teams are her ceiling team, but you may not have access to Sitlali and the other Melt options aren't as comfortable as her. Like Rosaria can give you the right amount of Melt, but that makes you circle impact really hard. And Escoffier can also work, but her application is mostly single target, so I would only recommend this if you have Sitlali, otherwise play her Overload teams with Chevruz. Eonton and the Roron work excellent as scroll holders, and you can complete the team with any Pyro or Electro characters of your choice. Most of the variants fall within the same margin, so it doesn't matter that much. You can also play Mavuika on vape teams too, although they are the least synergistic, and despite the fact that you clear fine, I wouldn't really recommend using it over Overload or Melt setups. And if you are currently using Mavuika as a DPS or plan to, I'd really recommend getting Sitlali to complete your teams if you don't have her, as Mavuika and Melt teams do so much damage, and I see it staying as a top tier team well into the future, due to how ahead it is of every other team in damage. And with the other DPSs so far after Mavuika's release still being far off her level of damage, it's safe to say that Hoyoverse doesn't intend to just power creep the team as of now. Now to round this out, for Mavuika's DPS playstyle, the only real issues is that for Melt teams it's a very unstable reaction, and her combos to maximize are quite difficult to learn, but to be honest, you don't really need to do those combos as of now, and you can argue Mavuika is restrictive, although there are so many Natlin options, even free ones, to where I don't think that's a real downside of her. So Mavuika is still just an amazing pull all around, whether that's as a DPS or sub DPS. I really don't think you can go wrong in picking her up. Now, the last character to discuss is going to be Emilie, in which Emilie is an all-field damage dealer that spikes in damage when on teams that have consistent burning application. And she's a great damage dealer. She does some of the most damage in the game while off-field, while having amazing AoE coverage in her burst, as well as mini nukes with her Ascension 1, on top of consistent Dendra application. She's practically all you could want from a sub DPS. The only problem is that besides Kinich teams, the supports we have gotten in Natlin just tend to be vastly better than whatever teams you could run with her. And I guess another downside with her is the fact that she only does damage with an amplification of her own. And despite the fact that her other teams besides Kinich are lower in power, they're still pretty good. For pyro units, you can build mono pyro teams with her where she slots in very non-intrusively. For cryo units, you can build reverse melt teams for more consistent melts. Xiangling is usually awkward due to her 20-second rotations, and Mavuika's pyro application sometimes isn't sufficient enough, especially for characters like Wriothesley. So if you just pair Emilie with either pyro main character or Mavuika, you're able to get consistent melts while having their benefits. For Hydra DPS, this is where I think she isn't that ideal, though if you're in mixed enemy situations where enemies are Hydra resistant, she can be used alongside Nuvela or Mualani for burn vape teams, where Dendra acts as a barrier to soak up any additional Hydra application. And for Electra units, you have the most goated team of all time being Quick Burn, with fast enough Electra application and semi-frequent Pyro application. You're able to play teams like this where you get both consistent burning and quicken uptime, allowing Emilie to dish out damage while your Electro carries benefit from quicken. Dendro characters can also use teams like this, but to a much lesser extent though. So yeah, Emilie does open up quite a few options for you, though as I said previously, these tend to just be like the B tier team options, compared to what most carries can run sadly. Also, I don't think I'll ever get a chance to flex it, so here's my top 1% Emilie. Overall, I think if I were to rank pull priority for this patch, Mavuika is 100% the highest, being both the best DPS and all-fields DPS in this lineup. Then all the other characters are quite niche, so it really is just context dependent. If you main Kinich, pick up Emilie. If you don't have the 4th slot for your Escoffier team, pick up Shenhe. And if you like Skirk or have all the pieces to make her good, then obviously pick her up. I do ultimately think that Shenhe will be the lowest in value just because I really can see them just making a more synergistic cryo or hydra support to complete Skirk teams, but that is kind of future impacting, so whatever. Let's go over the weapon banners now, as well as the character's vertical investment paths. I would normally start with Skirk, but to give a PSA, unless you are going for Shenhe C6, there is really no reason why you should be vertically investing into her. Farina Constellations are a better investment, Escoffier Constellations are a better investment, and her weapon. Shenhe's second constellation is 4 times worse than Skirk C1, and Shenhe's weapon is practically unusable on her because without Favonius, teams tend to just not reach the right energy requirements. So if you take anything away from this video, unless you're going all the way to C6, you can just skip Shenhe's vertical investment. For Skirk on the other hand, her weapon is fucking huge. If you don't have another 5-star weapon like Haran, Jade Cutter, or Mistsplitter, it should always be prioritized in my opinion over Constellations. But her C1 does offer more AoE benefits and front-loaded damage, so it can be better in practice than was reflected here. So we'll see, I guess. I'm still more inclined to recommend her weapon though if you're using something like Finale of the Deep. Also drip reasons. Moving on to Mavuika, her weapon is also a bigger increase than her C1, but her C1 gives you more pyro application uptime, which is a nice benefit, on top of the fact that her C2 is just extremely good for both her on and off-field playstyle. So I honestly think it might be better to just work yourself into getting the C2 due to how much it benefits both her playstyles. Archons will rerun at a much faster rate than normal characters, so even if you don't end up securing the C2 in this banner, you can still get her C1, which is still a nice boost while working towards getting her C2 in the future. And lastly, for Emilie, get that weapon. Emilie's weapon is not only an amazing stat stick for her, but also solves one of her problems with bursting, as usually it's recommended to build no ER in Emilie and burst every other rotation, but her signature weapon refunds enough energy to where you can get by with close to none on any team and have access to Emilie's burst every rotation, making it one of the biggest single upgrades you can give to a character, so I'd really recommend getting it. Her C2 does have some nice supportive benefits though, so maybe go for that if you only care about your Kinich himself doing the most damage. Though if you want to see a relatively cheap upgrade to your overall team's damage, then Elegy is. But with that, I have nothing else to say, so thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment who you're going for, as I'd love to hear and I respond to almost every single comment. Channel members, thank you so much for your support, it means the world to me. I love you all. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.